In a city where every corner hides a secret, one man's bold act of defiance against systemic brutality sparks a revolution that will shatter illusions and expose the raw truth. Dare to watch till the end. In the heart of Atlanta, beneath a sky that alternated between brooding clouds and fleeting bursts of sunlight, a quiet revolution was beginning to stir. The city, known for its vibrant culture and tumultuous history, had always been a place where the past clashed with the present, a crucible where dreams were both forged and shattered. On a cool autumn morning, as the streets of West End whispered secrets of generations past, and the scent of magnolia and promise mingled in the air, Tyrone Mitchell stepped out into a day that would irrevocably change the course of his life and that of his community. Tyrone, a resolute and imposing figure with the quiet intensity of a man who had weathered countless storms, walked along cracked sidewalks lined with faded murals and time-worn storefronts. His presence commanded attention without demanding it, each measured step echoing a lifetime of experiences, both the bitter taste of injustice and the steady hope for transformation. Formerly a Marine, he had been molded in the crucible of discipline and sacrifice. His eyes, dark and determined, revealed a man who refused to let the world silence his voice. For years, he had witnessed the subtle and overt abuses that plagued his neighborhood, a community where every day was an unspoken battle against a system that treated black lives as expendable. Today, however, he carried not just the scars of that past, but also a burning resolve to reshape it. The towering Liberty Courthouse, an enduring monument to authority and legacy, loomed in the distance. With its stately columns and heavy oak doors etched with the passage of time, it stood as a silent guardian of a judicial system steeped in tradition yet marred by hidden inequities. For decades, those walls had witnessed decisions that left the vulnerable voiceless and the powerful unchallenged. Now, in the shifting light of dawn, every stone of the courthouse seemed to vibrate with the possibility of change, a possibility that Tyrone intended to harness. He had watched as his neighbors endured unnecessary stops, as friends were humiliated on sidewalks, and as families were torn apart by a system designed to shield itself at the expense of truth. Each memory was a call to action, a reminder that silence had long been mistaken for acceptance. Tyrone's journey had begun long before this day. Born and raised in West End, he had seen the slow erosion of dignity inflicted by a system that never hesitated to brand him and others like him as outliers, as threats to a status quo that favored conformity over justice. The pain of racial profiling and the sting of unwarranted brutality were not abstract concepts to him. They were everyday realities that had hardened his resolve. In the quiet moments of reflection, as he recalled the piercing looks of disdain from officers and the hushed whispers among his community, he had resolved that enough was enough. He would no longer be a passive witness to the injustices that marred his world. He would become the architect of his own redemption. On that pivotal morning, Tyrone prepared himself mentally and physically for the challenge ahead. Every detail of his plan had been carefully rehearsed in the solitude of his modest apartment, a place where memories of both hardship and resilience coexisted. Maps of his neighborhood, annotated with notes about police behavior and moments of past abuse, were spread across a worn wooden table. His trusted hidden camera, compact yet powerful, lay beside a stack of carefully curated evidence. This was his arsenal, his way of ensuring that when the truth emerged, there would be no way to bury it beneath layers of denial and indifference. Tyrone's strategy was not born of a thirst for revenge, but of a deep-seated desire for justice. He knew that the system, with its unyielding veneer of authority, had long hidden its misdeeds in the shadows. The unspoken rules that governed police interactions in West End were designed to keep the marginalized silent, to ensure that any act of defiance would be quickly quashed. But Tyrone, Drawing on his military training and the lessons of a life spent fighting against overwhelming odds, had resolved to expose these injustices in their raw, unedited form. He would allow the very mechanism of oppression, the unchecked power of biased authority, to record its own downfall. Stepping out into the brisk morning air, Tyrone felt the weight of history beneath his feet. The streets of West End were familiar yet charged with a new electric tension. Every building, every weathered facade, bore the marks of decades of struggle. Neighbors exchanged knowing glances as they went about their daily routines, a silent acknowledgement of the long history of resistance that had defined their lives. The air was filled with the distant hum of Atlanta's energy, a symphony of sounds that told the story of a city in constant flux, ever ready to rise above its challenges. As he moved toward the heart of his neighborhood, Tyrone's thoughts drifted to the faces he had seen over the years. The elderly man who always nodded with resigned determination after being pulled over without cause. The young mother whose eyes filled with both fear and defiance at the sight of uniformed officers. And the teenagers who learned to navigate the streets with a wary step. These images, etched into his memory, fueled his determination. They were the very reasons why he could no longer stand by and allow history to repeat itself. Today was the day he would make a stand, not just for himself, but for every soul who had suffered in silence. The morning progressed, and the city began to stir with life. Street vendors arranged their colorful displays, jazz notes floated from open windows, and the collective spirit of Atlanta, though bruised by years of systemic neglect, shimmered with the potential for change. Amid this dynamic tableau, Tyrone's presence was both subtle and revolutionary. Every step he took was an act of defiance, every measured pace a challenge to a system that had long taken the dignity of his community for granted. In his mind, Tyrone recounted the countless injustices he had witnessed, stories that, until now, had been relegated to hushed conversations and quiet despair. The bitterness of those memories mingled with a burgeoning hope. He believed that if the truth could be captured on camera, if the undeniable evidence of abuse could be shown to the world, then the fabric of the system would begin to tear. There would be no hiding behind the polished veneer of authority. The raw truth would force accountability upon those who had long operated with impunity. At a critical juncture near a familiar intersection where the streetlights cast long shadows over the pavement and the distant sound of traffic created a rhythmic backdrop, Tyrone paused for a moment. He adjusted the small camera tucked under his jacket, ensuring it was recording. He surveyed the scene with an almost clinical precision. Every sound, every glance from a passerby, every subtle movement of uniformed officers became part of his mental checklist. He knew that in these moments lay the potential to capture the catalyst for change, a moment when the oppressors would reveal their true nature. The tension in the air was palpable as Tyrone continued his journey. Every instinct told him that today, more than any other day, the stakes were high. The hidden camera was his witness, his tool for exposing decades of abuse. It was not just about capturing a single encounter. It was about building a comprehensive record of a system that had long thrived on silence and fear. With every step, he was not only walking through a neighborhood steeped in history and struggle, but also paving the way for a future where truth would no longer be compromised by power. As the day unfolded, Tyrone's inner resolve only grew stronger. He knew that the trap he had set was risky. If anything went wrong, it could put him and his community in even greater peril. Yet, he was undeterred. The prospect of finally forcing a reckoning on those who had abused their authority outweighed every potential danger. His heart beat with the steady rhythm of a man who had embraced his destiny, a destiny in which he would no longer be a passive observer but an active force for change. In that moment, standing on the threshold of transformation, Tyrone Mitchell embodied the spirit of resistance. He was a man defined not by the scars of his past, but by the unyielding promise of a new dawn, a dawn where the voices of the oppressed would rise to challenge the injustices of the present. The streets of Atlanta, with all their contradictions and complexities, had become his battleground, and today he would make sure that the truth could no longer be hidden. As the sun climbed higher, casting its golden light over West End and illuminating the faces of those who had long lived in its shadows, the stage was set for an encounter that would change everything. Tyrone's eyes, reflecting both determination and the deep pain of a history marred by injustice, fixed on the horizon. He was ready to confront the system head-on, to let his actions speak louder than the silence that had defined his community for too long. With every step forward, he carried the hopes of a people yearning for a future where justice was not an empty promise but a living, breathing reality. And so, as the day began its steady march towards what would be a pivotal moment in Atlanta's history, Tyrone Mitchell walked with purpose. His journey was not merely a solitary walk down a familiar street. It was the prelude to a revolution. The weight of the past, the sting of injustice, and the unwavering light of hope converged within him, heralding the dawn of a new era. This was the beginning of a transformation that would resonate far beyond the confines of West End, a transformation that would force the world to confront its own biases, to acknowledge the long silence cries for justice, and to join in the fight for a future where every human life was valued and respected. Tyrone Mitchell spent countless nights poring over every detail, every scrap of evidence, and every whispered tale of injustice that had long haunted his West End neighborhood. In his small, dimly lit apartment on the edge of Atlanta's historic district, he meticulously mapped out the routes and moments that had defined a lifetime of police harassment. There was no room for error. Every step had to be calculated, every gesture rehearsed. The plan had grown over the years from a quiet, simmering anger into a determined strategy aimed at exposing a system that treated Black lives as expendable. Tyrone's mind raced through memories of unjust stops, of encounters with officers whose eyes burned with contempt, and of community members whose silence had become a reluctant norm. Now, with his hidden camera carefully secured in a small case and his notes neatly arranged, he was ready to set his trap in motion. The plan was as simple as it was revolutionary. Walk the same streets where he had suffered for too long, allow the same forces of systemic abuse to operate as usual, and capture every moment of arrogance and brutality on film. Every day, he had observed how police cruisers loitered for too long outside his block, how uniformed men exchanged knowing glances as they patrolled, and how they would often stop him for no good reason. Now, armed with undeniable evidence, he would let the system record its own misdeeds, a silent testimony that could not be ignored or spun away. On a crisp early morning, Tyrone emerged from his apartment with a calm that belied the intensity inside. The city was already stirring, the distant hum of traffic, the chatter of vendors setting up their stalls, and the occasional strains of Atlanta's soulful blues filled the air. As he walked along the familiar cracked sidewalks of West End, the neighborhood's worn facades and faded murals told stories of resilience and neglect in equal measure. Every corner, every intersection had its own secret, a quiet tale of struggle passed down through generations. Tyrone absorbed it all as he set his plan into motion. Today, he would walk these streets not as a victim of fate, but as a man determined to reclaim his narrative. His route was precise. He had chosen a stretch of road known for its troubling encounters, a block where officers had once stopped him for no discernible reason, where his presence had always been met with suspicion. Tyrone had already observed patterns: a cruiser idling too long, officers leaning casually against their vehicles, and the way their eyes would follow him like a silent accusation. He had captured snippets of conversations from bystanders, recorded the subtle shifts in tone as uniformed men moved in formation. Every detail, every nuance had been carefully cataloged in his mind. Now, he carried that mental ledger with him as he stepped confidently into the scene. The hidden camera, tucked discreetly under his jacket, was his silent witness. Its small lens had been adjusted to record in high definition without drawing any attention. Tyrone had practiced the art of blending in. He walked with an unremarkable air that allowed him to pass as just another resident of the neighborhood. Yet beneath the calm exterior, his mind was sharp and alert, capturing every suspicious movement of an officer, every raised eyebrow, every sidelong glance that spoke of an underlying bias. His objective was clear: let the system reveal itself through its own actions, unfiltered and undeniable. As he strolled down the street, Tyrone recalled the days when his neighbors lived in constant fear, when the mere sound of sirens would send shivers down spines and force families to hurry indoors. He remembered the elderly man who had once been pulled over for no reason at all, the young mother whose eyes had filled with tears as she explained to her child that such stops were just a part of life in their community. These memories, both painful and galvanizing, fueled his resolve. He had watched, time and again, as the injustice went unchallenged, as authorities twisted facts and buried the truth beneath layers of indifference. But today was different. Today, he would not let those voices be silenced any longer. Moving deeper into the neighborhood, Tyrone encountered subtle signals that his trap was working. A police cruiser, its engine humming softly, lingered outside a small grocery store. Two officers stood by its side, their postures relaxed yet their eyes flicking in his direction more frequently than he'd ever seen before. Their conversation, muffled by the ambient noise of early morning activity, contained hints of a scripted routine, one that had become all too predictable. Tyrone's hidden camera recorded every detail: the length of time they stared, the subtle changes in their expressions when they saw him approach, and the way one officer's tone shifted from casual to curt in an instant. Each captured moment added another layer to the evidence he was about to compile, a visual record of a system that had long operated in the shadows of discrimination. His heart beat steadily as he continued his walk, every step measured and deliberate. Along his route, he paused briefly at a familiar intersection where the streetlights cast long, dramatic shadows over the pavement. Here, the atmosphere was charged with the weight of memory and anticipation. He adjusted the angle of his hidden camera, ensuring that nothing would escape its unblinking lens. This spot had seen too many instances of abuse, too many lives affected by an unyielding system. Every sound, the murmur of distant traffic, the soft rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze, seemed to signal that the moment was near. As he proceeded, Tyrone became increasingly aware of the eyes upon him. A group of officers, stationed near an affluent block where manicured lawns and luxury vehicles told a different story from his own, began to watch him more intently. Their stares were heavy with unspoken assumptions, each glance a reminder that he was viewed as an anomaly in a neighborhood defined by exclusion. Yet Tyrone walked on, his gaze unwavering and his posture resolute. He was not deterred by their scrutiny. Rather, he allowed it to fortify his resolve. Every suspicious look, every whispered comment from passers-by was fuel for his mission, a mission to expose a truth that had long been buried under layers of systemic injustice. In one particularly tense moment, as he passed a block where the air seemed to thicken with anticipation, Tyrone noticed a pair of officers who stopped their idle conversation and turned their attention solely to him. Their voices, though quiet, carried an unmistakable edge of hostility. One of them remarked in a tone laced with prejudice that he didn't belong in that part of town. Tyrone's expression remained calm, but inside, his mind raced with the significance of every word. He knew that this confrontation, if captured in its entirety, would serve as undeniable evidence of the system's bias, a testament that would resonate with those who had long been silenced by fear. The meticulous planning that had gone into this day was now at its most critical juncture. Tyrone continued to move with the grace and precision of a man who had been trained for high-pressure situations, each step a blend of natural ease and calculated vigilance. His hidden camera was now recording the unfolding drama, the officer's increasingly aggressive body language, the quick glances exchanged among them, and the subtle tension in the air as they attempted to assert their authority. Every second was being documented, every detail preserved for a moment when the truth would no longer be denied. The trap was not simply a matter of capturing police behavior, it was an act of resistance against a system that had long thrived on silence and fear. Tyrone's eyes were fixed ahead, yet every fiber of his being was alert to the slightest shift in the environment. His mind replayed the countless encounters that had led to this moment, each memory, each injustice woven together into a tapestry of determination and defiance. He had made a promise to himself and to his community that the truth would be exposed, that the cycle of abuse would finally be broken. As the afternoon wore on, the tension in the neighborhood grew palpably thicker. The once routine patrols now seemed to carry an undercurrent of anxiety, as if the officers themselves sensed that something was amiss. Their conversations, once casual and dismissive, had taken on a clipped, wary tone whenever Tyrone passed by. Neighbors, long accustomed to the oppressive presence of the police, began to whisper among themselves. There was a growing anticipation that today's events might be the spark that ignited change. Tyrone's steps grew purposeful as he approached the heart of this charged zone. Every moment, every glance, was a reminder that he was not just a lone man walking the streets, but a representative of all those who had been wronged by a system built on bias and unchecked power. With each step, he felt the weight of history and the promise of redemption. The hidden camera captured the world in real time, the rustle of leaves, the shifting expressions on faces, the undeniable aura of determination that radiated from him. By late afternoon, as the warm light began to mellow into golden hues, Tyrone reached a pivotal point, a stretch of road notorious for its history of police encounters. Here, the atmosphere was charged with an almost electric tension, and every detail seemed magnified by the collective memory of past abuses. As he paused momentarily to adjust his camera, his mind was flooded with the faces of those who had suffered in silence, neighbors, friends, and community members whose stories had been hidden for too long. It was here, in this crucible of memory and expectation, that his trap would be sprung. Every hidden lens, every carefully recorded second, was a piece of the puzzle that would soon force the system to confront its own dark truth. With the trap set and every precaution taken, Tyrone resumed his journey with renewed determination. The plan was simple, yet revolutionary. Allow the officers to act as they always had, and record every abusive moment without interference. This was not an act of provocation, but one of exposure, a final stand against a system that had long operated in the shadows of injustice. As he walked on, the quiet determination in his eyes spoke volumes. He knew that once the footage was released, the undeniable evidence of systemic abuse would spark a wave of accountability that could not be silenced. The day's progression was marked by small victories. The lingering stares, the hurried glances, and the nervous adjustments by the officers when they saw him approach. Each detail was captured in unyielding clarity, building a case that would soon force the city to reckon with its past. Tyrone's quiet resolve, the discipline of his stride, and the unwavering focus in his gaze were all testaments to a man who had decided that the truth, no matter how harsh, would no longer be hidden. In that moment, as the golden afternoon light enveloped the streets of West End, Tyrone Mitchell embraced his destiny. His trap was laid with the care of a seasoned strategist, the precision of a warrior, and the heart of a man who refused to accept injustice as the norm. Every hidden moment, every recorded second, was a promise that the world would soon see the truth, a truth that had long been suppressed by those in power. And as he moved forward, the promise of exposure and the hope of a better future pulsed in every step. Tyrone Mitchell's steady stride through West End had been measured and deliberate, every step imbued with the quiet determination of a man who had spent years preparing for this very moment. The sun, now dipping low to cast long, dramatic shadows across the cracked sidewalks of his neighborhood, lent the day an almost surreal quality. He had reached the point where his meticulous planning would collide with the entrenched power of the system, where the hidden camera under his worn jacket would finally capture the moment of reckoning. The air pulsed with anticipation as he moved deeper into the territory where past abuses were an ever-present specter, and every corner held memories of those who had been silenced by unjust authority. At a busy intersection near an elegant row of restored brownstones, Tyrone sensed the shift in energy that marked the trigger point of his plan. The street, usually filled with the gentle murmur of voices and the distant sounds of daily commerce, now hummed with an undercurrent of tension. A police cruiser, its dark paint gleaming in the fading light, was parked strategically along the curb, a position that Tyrone knew all too well from countless encounters. Two officers stood by the vehicle, engaged in subdued conversation that suddenly ceased as they caught sight of him. Their eyes, cold and calculating, followed his every move, and Tyrone felt his pulse quicken in anticipation. As he approached, one of the officers, a tall man with a hardened expression and a badge that shone with unwarranted authority, took a step forward. His voice, clipped and edged with suspicion, broke the silence. "Hey, you, what are you doing around here?" The words, though mundane and routine, carried the weight of past injustices. Tyrone's heart pounded, but his face remained a mask of calm determination. He replied evenly, "I'm just taking a walk, like anyone else in this neighborhood." His tone, steady and unprovocative, was a deliberate act, a challenge to the unspoken assumption that his presence was inherently suspicious. The taller officer's eyes narrowed as he exchanged a look with his partner, whose gaze was equally cold and dismissive. In that brief, charged moment, Tyrone's hidden camera captured every detail: the slight twitch at the corner of an eye, the stiffening of posture, and the subtle, almost imperceptible nod between the two. It was as if, in that instant, the trap had been sprung. Their routine surveillance of his movements had shifted from casual indifference to a deliberate, predatory scrutiny. Without warning, the officer with the square jaw advanced further. "You don't really belong here, do you?" he spat, his words laced with a disdain that had haunted Tyrone for years. The air around them seemed to thicken with the weight of decades of racial prejudice, and the bystanders, who had long endured similar encounters, looked on with a mixture of apprehension and hope. For Tyrone, these were the moments he had both dreaded and anticipated. Every memory of unjust stops and hostile stares fueled his resolve. Every oppressive word was a spark in the fire of his determination. Tyrone stood his ground, his eyes never wavering from those of the approaching officer. "I live here," he said quietly but firmly. "I have every right to walk these streets." His voice carried not only his assertion, but the cumulative strength of countless voices that had been silenced before him. The officer's sneer deepened, and the tension escalated as the second officer moved forward, closing the gap with calculated precision. Their movements, now synchronized in a manner that betrayed their expectation of his submission, formed a circle that encroached upon him. At that moment, the hidden camera continued to record, its lens capturing the raw, unedited reality unfolding before it. Tyrone's mind raced back to the many nights he had spent planning for this confrontation, nights filled with quiet resolve and meticulous attention to every detail of police behavior. His training as a former Marine had taught him discipline, focus, and the importance of maintaining composure under fire. Now, in the heat of the moment, those lessons served him well. Every step, every gesture was part of a larger narrative that would soon expose the inherent injustices of a system built on unchecked power. The conversation between the officers turned heated. "We've seen you around here too many times," one of them muttered, his tone shifting from curiosity to thinly veiled hostility. "Maybe you should leave before things get out of hand." Yet Tyrone's response was measured and resolute. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice echoing with the calm strength of a man who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. In that brief exchange, every nuance, each raised eyebrow, every dismissive shake of the head was recorded. It was an electric moment, a collision of the oppressive past with the defiant present, where Tyrone's trap had now fully activated. The tension mounted rapidly. As the officers exchanged quick, furtive glances and their grips tightened around their batons, Tyrone's internal resolve crystallized. He was prepared for physical confrontation, not out of a desire for violence, but as a necessary means of self-defense and a demonstration of his unwavering dignity. Every muscle in his body was poised, his mind focused solely on maintaining control and capturing the truth. The officers, convinced that he was a threat, advanced with increasing aggression. Then, in a sudden explosive moment, the first officer lunged forward, attempting to grab Tyrone's jacket. Instinctively, Tyrone sidestepped, his body moving with the fluid precision of a man trained in combat. His hidden camera captured the entire movement, the quick dodge, the shift in balance, the very expression of calm determination on his face. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he stated, his voice low yet unyielding. "I'm just walking." But the officers, fueled by their own assumptions and a deep-seated arrogance, misinterpreted his calm as defiance. The confrontation escalated quickly. Words became shouts, and shouts blurred into the sounds of scuffling feet and the dull thud of impact on pavement. The officer's aggressive attempts to subdue him were met with Tyrone's disciplined resistance. His arms moved defensively, parrying rough attempts to seize him without ever crossing the line into violence. Every movement was calculated, every reaction a reflection of his inner strength and resilience. The hidden camera did not miss a beat. It recorded the rising volume of the confrontation, the strained expressions of the officers, and the unwavering steadiness of Tyrone's composure despite the physical force being exerted upon him. For a few long, agonizing moments, time seemed to suspend. The crowd that had gathered along the street, made up of wary neighbors and concerned onlookers, watched in breathless silence as Tyrone's struggle unfolded. Their eyes, filled with a mixture of dread and hope, recognized that they were witnessing not just a physical altercation, but the culmination of years of silent suffering. The oppressive power of a system that had long dehumanized black men was now being recorded in vivid detail, a record that would leave no room for denial once the footage was released. As the officers pressed in, Tyrone's mind remained clear. He recalled the faces of those who had been wronged in his community. The elderly man pulled over without cause, the young mother forced to hide her tears, the countless voices that had been silenced by unjust authority. These memories, imbued with both pain and an unwavering hope for justice, fortified his resolve. He knew that if he could simply hold on, if he could just capture every moment of this encounter, then the truth would be undeniable. It was the very essence of his plan, to let the system reveal its own brutality, to expose the hypocrisy and unchecked power that had governed these streets for far too long. Despite the mounting physical pressure, Tyrone continued to speak calmly, his voice steady even as his body endured the officer's force. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he repeated, his words carrying the weight of his life's experiences. The officers, caught in their own cycle of aggression, misinterpreted his calm as a challenge to their authority. a challenge they were determined to quash. In that critical moment, Tyrone's hidden camera captured a particularly jarring exchange. The officer's sneer, the way his hand reached out to forcefully grab Tyrone, and the quick, almost balletic movement by which Tyrone dodged, all juxtaposed against the backdrop of a neighborhood that had long known such scenes all too well. The intensity of the encounter reached its apex when one officer's aggressive maneuver triggered an unexpected reaction. As Tyrone deftly sidestepped yet another attempt to detain him, the officer's frustration spilled over in a burst of unrestrained anger. A sharp cry erupted, a sound of both shock and vindication as Tyrone's carefully laid trap finally caught up with those who had sought to intimidate him. Every nuance of the altercation, from the officer's mounting frustration to the subtle shift in the crowd's expression from apprehension to silent solidarity, was captured in pristine detail by the hidden camera. In that pivotal moment, the trap was sprung entirely. The officer's aggressive actions, once intended to assert control, became the very evidence of systemic abuse. Their movements, recorded without filter or alteration, laid bare the stark reality of a system that had long operated in a haze of prejudice and unchecked authority. Tyrone, standing firm amid the chaos, felt a surge of triumph intertwined with the deep, enduring pain of the countless injustices he had witnessed over the years. His eyes, fixed steadily ahead, reflected not only the physical struggle unfolding, but also a larger, unyielding determination to force accountability upon those who had misused their power. The confrontation was brief, but seared into the collective memory of everyone present. As the officers, now momentarily disoriented by the force of their own aggression and the unwavering resilience of Tyrone, hesitated, the hidden camera continued to record every lingering moment. Neighbors began to murmur in subdued voices, their expressions shifting from fear to a cautious hope that, perhaps, finally, the cycle of abuse could be broken. Tyrone's every move, every measured response was a testament to the strength of a man who refused to be reduced to a statistic or silenced by oppression. The physical altercation gradually gave way to a tense standoff. Officers, realizing that their actions were being documented and that the weight of undeniable evidence was mounting, exchanged furtive glances that betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. Tyrone, however, remained the picture of calm defiance. His steady breathing, the measured cadence of his voice, and the unwavering resolve in his eyes spoke of a man who had transcended the physical struggle to embody a broader, more profound challenge to systemic injustice. In those final moments of the encounter, as the officers slowly began to retreat and the crowd's murmur grew louder with cautious optimism, Tyrone allowed himself a brief, silent exhalation. The trap had been sprung, and the raw, unfiltered truth of the encounter was now sealed in his hidden camera's memory. What had unfolded on that Atlanta street was far more than a confrontation between a man and the police. It was a microcosm of the long-standing battle against systemic abuse, a decisive moment when the oppressed began to reclaim their power through undeniable evidence. The encounter was over, yet its reverberations would echo far beyond that street corner. Every captured moment, every recorded second, was a testament to the courage of a man who had chosen to stand up, to resist, and to force the truth into the light. Tyrone Mitchell had not only defended his own dignity in the face of aggression, but had also set in motion a chain of events that promised to challenge the very foundations of an unjust system. The power dynamics had shifted in that fleeting, intense moment, a moment that would soon ignite a movement for accountability and reform throughout the city. In the wake of that fateful confrontation, the ripple effects of Tyrone Mitchell's courageous act spread through the West End and far beyond the streets of Atlanta. The hidden footage captured every moment of that encounter, and within hours, it exploded across social media. What had been a quiet neighborhood filled with the weight of centuries of unspoken injustice suddenly became the epicenter of a public outcry. Neighbors, activists, and ordinary citizens gathered in clusters on street corners, at community centers, and in local cafes, each voice rising in anger and hope as they watched the evidence of police misconduct unfold. The atmosphere, once heavy with resigned silence, was now charged with determination, a shared demand for accountability that resonated across every platform. Local news outlets, spurred on by viral clips and impassioned community testimonials, began running extended coverage of the incident. Headlines screamed of a system exposed and a turning point in policing, drawing both national and regional attention. Journalists dug deep into archives, uncovering records of previous injustices that had long been swept under the rug. In investigative reports, seasoned reporters connected the dots between Tyrone's experience and a long-standing pattern of racial profiling and excessive force in the area. The media coverage was raw and unfiltered. Every frame of Tyrone's recorded encounter was analyzed, debated, and shared. For the first time in many years, the stories of those who had suffered in silence were given a loud, indisputable voice. Amid the growing media frenzy, community leaders and local civil rights organizations seized the moment to mobilize. In small meeting rooms at neighborhood churches and public libraries, groups of residents convened to discuss their own experiences and to plan collective action. There were heated debates and tearful accounts of past abuses, stories of elderly residents pulled over without cause, of children taught to fear the sound of sirens, and of families whose lives had been upended by a system that saw them as disposable. These gatherings were not just expressions of anger, they were the beginning of a transformative dialogue. The community recognized that this was their moment to reclaim power, to insist that every person in West End, and indeed in all of Atlanta, be treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. A wave of peaceful protests quickly emerged from these grassroots meetings. Organized by local activists and supported by community influencers, demonstrations were held in prominent public spaces such as Centennial Olympic Park and along Peachtree Street, chanting slogans that demanded justice now and no more silence. Demonstrators filled the streets, their signs and banners a vivid contrast to the old narratives of quiet resignation. These protests were not chaotic riots. They were carefully organized, passionate calls for reform. Leaders of these movements urged the city's elected officials to listen to their voices and to enact meaningful change. Their message was simple yet powerful. The days of unchecked power and impunity were over. City officials, initially reluctant to acknowledge the depth of the problem, found themselves forced into action by the mounting public pressure. In emergency sessions at Atlanta City Hall, council members and the mayor convened to address the issue head-on. In a public address that was broadcast live, the mayor acknowledged the community's pain and frustration. He promised sweeping reforms and pledged to overhaul the policies that had allowed police misconduct to flourish for decades. "We cannot allow the legacy of abuse to define our future," he declared, his voice resolute amid the murmurs of an attentive crowd. His statement, though measured, carried a weight of promise that began to shift the tide of public opinion. For many, it was a turning point, proof that the voices of the marginalized were finally being heard at the highest levels of government. Within the Atlanta Police Department, the fallout was equally profound. The explosive release of Tyrone's footage forced a rare moment of introspection among high-ranking officials. Internal reviews, which had long been perfunctory and opaque, were suddenly thrust into the spotlight. A new task force was swiftly assembled, comprising not only internal affairs investigators, but also community representatives and independent experts. Their mandate was clear: to scrutinize every aspect of the incident, to hold the officers accountable, and to recommend structural reforms that would restore public trust. The task force's findings were damning: a pattern of racial bias, excessive force, and unwarranted stops that had been systematically ignored. These revelations sent shockwaves through the department, shaking the very foundations of an institution that had long prided itself on order and control. As the internal investigation unfolded, the community's pressure only intensified. Public forums were organized in every corner of West End, where residents expressed both their anguish and their resolve. At one such forum held in a refurbished community center in the heart of the neighborhood, a respected local pastor delivered a stirring address that called for unity and relentless vigilance. "Our streets have been scarred by fear for too long," he proclaimed, his voice resonating with the deep conviction of a man who had seen generations live under the weight of injustice. "Today, we stand together not only to demand accountability, but to rebuild our community on the foundation of respect and dignity." His words were met with thunderous applause, and for a moment, the heavy legacy of the past seemed to lift, replaced by the bright promise of change. In the days that followed, the task force's recommendations led to tangible reforms. New protocols were introduced requiring mandatory body cameras with strict usage guidelines, comprehensive de-escalation training for all officers, and the establishment of an independent civilian oversight board tasked with monitoring police conduct. These measures, once seen as distant ideals, were now being implemented with an urgency that reflected the collective will of the community. The Oversight Board, composed of legal experts, community leaders, and former law enforcement personnel, was given the authority to investigate complaints and to impose disciplinary actions without interference. For many residents, this was a historic breakthrough, a step toward ensuring that the abuses of the past would never be allowed to recur. The impact of these institutional changes rippled throughout Atlanta. Across the city, similar stories of abuse began to surface, and advocates used Tyrone's case as a rallying cry for broader reform. Social media campaigns under hashtags like #TruthInTheStreets and #Justice for West End connected disparate communities, creating a digital tapestry of resistance that spanned from the historic neighborhoods of Atlanta to the farthest reaches of the country. Influential voices, celebrities, activists, and everyday citizens joined the conversation, amplifying the call for systemic change. What had once been isolated incidents were now recognized as part of a larger, deeply entrenched problem that demanded collective action. For many, the transformation was not without its challenges. There were those within the police department and in the political establishment who clung to the old ways, fearful of losing the power and control they had long wielded. Some officers, now under intense scrutiny, expressed their frustration and fear of retribution. Internal memos and whispered conversations hinted at a struggle within the department, between those who saw the reforms as a necessary evolution and those who believed that change would weaken their authority. Yet the tide of public opinion was undeniable. As more evidence emerged and more victims spoke out, the demand for accountability grew louder and more insistent. In neighborhoods that had long been shrouded in fear, a cautious optimism began to emerge. Parents who had once told their children to be wary of the flashing lights now spoke of a future where every citizen would be treated with fairness. Community leaders organized workshops to educate residents about their rights, ensuring that the hard-won lessons of the past would not be forgotten. Grassroots organizations collaborated with local schools to instill a sense of civic duty and empowerment in the next generation. In these spaces, the legacy of Tyrone Mitchell's recorded encounter was not just evidence of past abuse, it was a catalyst for ongoing dialogue and meaningful change. Amid the whirlwind of reforms and community mobilization, Tyrone remained a quiet but potent symbol of resistance. His hidden camera footage, which had once been a solitary act of defiance, had now become a powerful document that galvanized a movement. He was invited to speak at town hall meetings, community rallies, and even on local radio shows, where he recounted his story with a measured tone that belied the intense personal pain and resolve behind his words. His message was clear that the truth, once illuminated, had the power to dismantle even the most deeply entrenched systems of injustice. As city officials and community advocates celebrated the reforms, many cautioned that the battle was far from over. The changes in Atlanta's law enforcement practices were a significant victory, but they were only the beginning of a long journey toward true systemic reform. The legacy of decades of bias and brutality would not be undone overnight, and there remained a critical need for ongoing vigilance and accountability. Yet, for the first time in many years, there was a sense that the public was watching, that every misstep would be met with immediate scrutiny, and that no one, regardless of their position, was above the law. In the midst of this transformative period, the impact of the fallout was felt not only in the corridors of power, but also in the everyday lives of Atlanta's residents. In West End, where every crack in the sidewalk and every faded mural bore testimony to years of struggle, there was a renewed sense of hope. People began to take to the streets with a cautious optimism, their voices now united in a chorus of accountability. Community events that once had the subdued air of resignation were now filled with spirited discussions and public commitments to monitor and safeguard the progress that had been achieved. The collective memory of past abuses was being replaced by a shared vision of a fairer future, a future where every individual was valued and every injustice was met with swift, unwavering action. The response from the media, too, played a vital role in sustaining the momentum. As televised news segments and online articles dissected every detail of the incident and its aftermath, public discourse shifted dramatically. Criticism of the old ways was no longer a fringe sentiment. It became the mainstream narrative. Editorials and opinion pieces highlighted the urgent need for change, and social media campaigns ensured that the conversation would not fade into obscurity. Every new piece of evidence, every heartfelt testimony, and every public protest reinforced the message that accountability was no longer optional. It was essential for a just society. Meanwhile, within the police department, the fallout from Tyrone's encounter had created a palpable sense of uncertainty. The officers who had once moved with unchallenged authority now faced an environment of rigorous oversight and public scrutiny. New protocols meant that every stop, every interaction, and every use of force would be documented and reviewed. The old culture of silence had been shattered by the collective demands of a community that had long been marginalized. Officers found themselves having to justify their actions in a way that had never been required before, and many struggled to adapt to this new reality. The transformation was not without resistance. There were those who tried to downplay the significance of the incident or to claim that the system had simply been misunderstood. However, as more and more victims of similar abuses stepped forward, the narrative became undeniable. A system built on unchecked power had been exposed, and the community was united in its demand for a fair and accountable law enforcement apparatus. As dusk turned to night and the protests continued to ripple through the streets of Atlanta, the legacy of that historic day began to crystallize. The once hidden truths, captured in raw and unfiltered footage, had ignited a movement that promised to redefine the very nature of authority and accountability in the city. The impact of the confrontation extended far beyond the immediate reactions. It had laid the foundation for lasting institutional reforms and had empowered a community that had long been silenced by fear. Every voice, every testimonial, and every act of defiance contributed to a mosaic of resistance that was as intricate as it was powerful. In the halls of government, legislators and city officials began to draft new laws and policies that would ensure such abuses would never recur. Budget allocations were shifted to support community oversight programs, and grants were provided to local organizations dedicated to monitoring police practices. The institutional response was multifaceted. Legal, social, and political spheres all converged to form a comprehensive strategy for change. It was a strategy built on the recognition that justice was not a commodity to be dispensed at the whim of the powerful, but a fundamental right that must be fiercely protected and continuously renewed. For the residents of West End, the aftermath was a bittersweet mixture of relief, hope, and lingering skepticism. The scars of past abuses could not be erased overnight, but the collective action and unwavering determination that had followed Tyrone's act of defiance offered a promise of renewal. Community leaders organized regular forums where citizens could share their experiences, demand accountability, and participate in shaping the future of law enforcement in their neighborhood. In these gatherings, the stories of pain were interwoven with those of triumph, a reminder that every act of resistance had the power to heal and transform. The tangible changes in the institutional framework were celebrated as monumental victories, but they were also a call to vigilance. Every new policy was accompanied by an unspoken understanding that the struggle for justice was ongoing. The community's response, as reflected in the passionate debates on social media and the powerful testimonials shared in public spaces, underscored that the fight against systemic abuse would continue until every voice was heard and every act of injustice was met with swift retribution. As night settled over Atlanta, the echoes of the day's events lingered in the cool air. The historic Jefferson City Courthouse, once a fortress of unyielding authority, now stood as a symbol of a new era. An era where transparency, accountability, and collective action reigned supreme. The transformation was not complete, and many challenges lay ahead, but the seeds of change had been sown in the hearts of the people. The fall of an oppressive system had begun with the courage of one man, and it had grown into a movement that promised to reshape the very fabric of society. In that charged atmosphere of hope and determination, every citizen understood that the future would be defined not by the shadows of past abuses, but by the light of truth and the strength of a united community. The fallout from Tyrone Mitchell's recorded encounter was not merely a momentary spark of outrage. It was the ignition of a long overdue revolution that would demand justice and accountability at every level. And so, as Atlanta's skyline shimmered in the night and the voices of the people echoed through its streets, the legacy of that day was etched into the collective memory of a city on the brink of transformation. The community had risen, the institutions had been challenged, and a new chapter in the pursuit of justice had begun. The fight was far from over, but the power of the people had shown that even the most entrenched systems could be dismantled by the force of truth, unity, and unwavering determination. As dawn broke over Atlanta, a renewed spirit began to infuse the city, reshaping the narrative of a community long burdened by injustice. West End was now a canvas of transformation, a living testament to the power of resilience, accountability, and the unyielding human spirit. Tyrone Mitchell, whose defiant act had sparked a chain reaction of reform, now stood not as a solitary figure of resistance, but as the embodiment of a collective legacy. The once bitter echoes of past abuses were gradually giving way to a chorus of hope, empowerment, and redemption that promised to redefine what it meant to live with dignity in a society once marred by systemic bias. In the months following that pivotal confrontation, the hidden camera footage had ignited sweeping changes. The reforms initiated by local authorities and championed by community leaders had transformed the landscape of law enforcement in Atlanta. Mandatory body cameras, rigorous de-escalation training, and an independent civilian oversight board were now pillars of a reform system. The Jefferson City Courthouse, a symbol of old authority, had been repurposed into a beacon of transparency and justice. Every policy change, every new measure of accountability was a step toward a future where every person, regardless of their background, could expect to be treated with fairness and respect. For Tyrone, the journey from defiance to transformation was deeply personal. Each day, as he walked through streets once haunted by fear, he felt the heavy weight of history begin to lift. He recalled the countless instances of unwarranted stops, the humiliation inflicted by those who once believed their authority was absolute. But now, those memories were slowly being rewritten. Neighbors who had once whispered in fear began to speak out in community meetings, and the local media, once reluctant to challenge entrenched power, now broadcast the voices of those who had long suffered in silence. Tyrone's courageous act had evolved into a movement that not only sought to expose past wrongs, but to build a future defined by mutual respect and unyielding hope. The transformation extended far beyond the streets of West End. In local schools, community centers, and even city halls, discussions of justice, equity, and civic engagement blossomed into a vibrant dialogue. Youth groups organized workshops and rallies, drawing inspiration from the legacy of Tyrone's defiance. They learned that change did not come from quiet resignation, but from standing together and demanding accountability. Their fresh perspectives, fueled by the determination of a new generation, sparked initiatives that aimed to educate and empower citizens. Conversations once dominated by fear and mistrust were now replaced by hopeful debates about how to create lasting change, how to ensure that the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. At the heart of this metamorphosis was a deep, shared commitment to healing. Tyrone, now seen as a local hero, dedicated himself to mentoring young activists and community leaders. He organized forums where people could share their stories, their pain, and their dreams for a better future. These gatherings became safe havens for those seeking both solace and inspiration, a place where the raw emotions of the past could be transformed into constructive energy. The community's collective narrative shifted from one of victimhood to one of empowerment, and every personal testimony added a vibrant thread to the tapestry of their shared legacy. In his quiet moments of reflection, Tyrone recognized that transformation was not merely about overturning old structures, it was about building new ones. He worked tirelessly with local officials and activists to establish programs that supported mental health, education, and economic opportunities for those who had been marginalized. His efforts were not driven by a desire for personal glory, but by an unwavering belief in the possibility of redemption for a system, for a community, and for himself. Every step forward was a step toward reconciliation, where the wounds of the past were acknowledged but not allowed to dictate the future. The redemptive power of these changes became evident in the subtle shifts in everyday life. Neighbors greeted each other with smiles that carried genuine warmth, and community events once shrouded in the shadow of fear now burst with energy and optimism. Public spaces, once battlegrounds of tension, transformed into forums for open dialogue and celebration. The local police, now under strict oversight, moved with a cautious professionalism that reflected the new era of accountability. Even the Jefferson City Courthouse, once a stark monument to unyielding authority, resonated with the promise of a fair and just future, a future where every case would be heard, every voice would be valued, and every life would be respected. Tyrone's journey had come full circle. He had set out to expose the dark underbelly of a corrupt system, and in doing so, had helped ignite a movement that transcended individual experiences. His hidden camera had not only captured the abuse of power, but had become the catalyst for an awakening, a reminder that true justice begins when people dare to shine a light on the truth. Now, as he walked the revitalized streets of West End, he carried with him the legacy of transformation and redemption, a legacy that was built on the foundation of collective action, unyielding courage, and a relentless pursuit of equity. In this new chapter, Tyrone understood that the fight for justice was ongoing, that transformation was a continuous process rather than a single, definitive moment. Yet he also knew that every small victory, every act of resistance, and every reform implemented was a step toward a society where the dignity of every human being was safeguarded. The scars of the past would always remain, but they would serve as reminders of how far the community had come and as a beacon for the future. As the day drew to a close, the golden hues of the setting sun bathed Atlanta in a soft, hopeful light. Tyrone paused at the edge of his block, looking out over a neighborhood that had once been a place of silent suffering, but was now alive with the sound of voices united in the call for change. In that quiet, reflective moment, he felt a deep sense of purpose and responsibility. The journey ahead was long and challenges still loomed on the horizon, but the legacy of transformation and redemption was firmly in place, a legacy that promised not just to heal old wounds, but to build a future where every person could walk free, unburdened by the chains of injustice. And so, as Atlanta embraced this new dawn with renewed determination, Tyrone Mitchell and his community moved forward together, united in their hope, resolute in their pursuit of a just and compassionate society, and ever watchful of the promise that every voice, every life, and every act of courage would pave the way for a better tomorrow. In reflecting on the journey that unfolded, we witness a story of relentless courage, transformation, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. Tyrone Mitchell's path, from the early days of quiet defiance through a meticulously laid trap, an explosive encounter, and the subsequent community upheaval to the dawn of a renewed legacy, stands as a testament to the indomitable human spirit. His story began in the heart of West End, Atlanta, where a neighborhood once shadowed by systemic injustice and silenced voices was now awakened by his determination. With every deliberate step, Tyrone transformed his pain and anger into a powerful act of resistance, capturing on film the abuses that had long plagued his community. This hidden evidence not only exposed the deep-seated prejudice and unchecked power of the authorities, but also ignited a movement for reform that rippled through every corner of the city. The footage of that fateful encounter shattered the silence that had for too long allowed injustice to thrive. It forced local media, government, and citizens alike to confront a harsh truth. The system, which had once operated with impunity, was finally being held accountable. Community meetings erupted with raw emotion as neighbors and activists shared stories of pain, indignation, and hope. In those moments, the voices of those who had been marginalized resonated louder than ever, proving that the power of the people could indeed dismantle an oppressive structure. As protests swelled and reforms began to take shape, Atlanta transformed from a city of quiet resignation to one pulsating with the promise of change. Tyrone's personal transformation became the catalyst for a larger revolution. His record of defiance was not an isolated act of resistance. It was a spark that lit the fire of collective action. With every new policy implemented, every officer held accountable, and every community voice raised, the legacy of past abuses was being rewritten. The Jefferson City Courthouse, once a monument to unchecked authority, evolved into a symbol of transparency and hope. New procedures, stricter oversight, and comprehensive reforms were introduced, ensuring that every individual, regardless of race or background, would be afforded the dignity and justice they deserve. The ripple effect of Tyrone's actions extended well beyond the streets of West End. His courage inspired local leaders, young activists, and everyday citizens to stand together and demand change. Community outreach programs blossomed, empowering residents to learn about their rights and actively participate in shaping the future of law enforcement. Town hall meetings, public forums, and grassroots campaigns created a platform for open dialogue, where the lessons of the past could be transformed into actionable solutions for the future. In every conversation, every rally, and every protest, Tyrone's story echoed as a powerful reminder that true change begins when individuals dare to challenge the status quo. At its core, this saga teaches us that transformation is not an isolated event, but a continuous process built on persistence, unity, and an unyielding commitment to truth. Tyrone's journey shows us that even when the odds are stacked against us, a single determined voice can create a ripple effect strong enough to transform an entire community. It reminds us that accountability and justice are not abstract ideals. They are attainable when we refuse to accept injustice as the norm. Each act of defiance, no matter how small, contributes to a larger tapestry of resistance and renewal. The moral of this story is clear. Never underestimate the power of one individual's resolve. When faced with systemic oppression and ingrained prejudice, the courage to stand up, to document the truth, and to demand accountability can spark a chain reaction that transforms not only institutions but entire communities. In our daily lives, we must remember that change often starts at the individual level. Whether it is speaking out against bias, supporting local initiatives, or simply standing in solidarity with those who have been marginalized, every action counts. The strength of a united community lies in its ability to harness collective power and to insist that every voice matters. Moreover, this story challenges us to reflect on our own lives. It calls on us to examine the systems we encounter, be it in our workplaces, our schools, or our neighborhoods, and to hold them accountable for ensuring fairness and respect for all. By embracing empathy, educating ourselves, and actively participating in our communities, we can contribute to a future where injustice is not tolerated. The journey toward equality is long and often fraught with setbacks. But the resolve demonstrated by Tyrone and his community shows that, with persistence, even the most entrenched systems can be reformed. As we move forward, let us carry the lessons of this narrative with us. Let it serve as a reminder that our individual actions can have a profound impact. Stand up when you see injustice, document the truth when it is hidden, and always remember that the fight for justice is a collective endeavor. Together, we have the power to transform our communities, to dismantle systems of oppression, and to build a future where every individual is seen, heard, and valued. If this story of transformation, redemption, and relentless pursuit of justice has inspired you, please join our movement by subscribing to our channel. Your support not only enables us to continue sharing these powerful narratives, but also fuels the drive to shed light on stories that demand change. Together, we can ensure that the legacy of truth, courage, and accountability lives on, inspiring more voices to rise and more hearts to unite in the fight for a better tomorrow. Thank you for being a part of this journey. Remember, your voice matters, and every act of resistance, no matter how small, contributes to the lasting legacy of change. Subscribe now and join us as we continue to fight for justice and build a future where every life is valued.